The hardware store clerk, full script. The FBI task force said the bombing threat had gone cold. No suspicious purchases. No traceable materials. What they didn't know was that the answer was working behind the counter at Miller's Hardware, recognizing explosive component purchases through the eyes of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades preventing domestic terrorism attacks. Welcome to The Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden vigilance and protecting innocent lives, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Miller's Hardware had been serving the community for 43 years, its narrow aisles packed with everything from garden hoses to electrical components, paintbrushes to plumbing supplies. The kind of neighborhood store where contractors knew they could find specialty bolts, homeowners could get advice on weekend projects, and farmers could pick up supplies without driving to the big box stores outside town. Frank Kowalski had been working behind the counter for 2 years, helping customers navigate the maze of products with the patient knowledge of someone who understood that the right tool could make the difference between a successful project and a frustrating failure. At 64, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a retired engineer who enjoyed helping people solve practical problems. But Frank's attention to customer purchases went far beyond normal retail observation. While most store clerks focused on inventory, pricing, and customer service, Frank automatically tracked purchase combinations that could indicate explosive device construction. His trained eye recognized when seemingly innocent materials, fertilizer, metal pipes, electronic components, chemical products, were being bought together in patterns that suggested bomb making, rather than legitimate home improvement or agricultural use. What the customers didn't know was that Frank Kowalski had never been an engineer. For 19 years, he'd been Special Agent Frank Kowalski, ATF Explosives Division, specializing in domestic terrorism prevention, bomb-making material tracking, and cases where everyday hardware store purchases were being assembled into weapons designed to kill innocent people. He'd prevented bombings at government buildings, schools, and public events by recognizing the purchasing patterns that preceded every successful domestic terrorism attack. His retirement 2 years ago had been earned through decades of high-stress counterterrorism work. His instinct for recognizing explosive device components had been permanent. "Morning, Frank," said Bob Martinez, a regular customer who owned a small construction business. "I need some PVC pipe and electrical wire for a bathroom renovation." "Aisle 7 for the pipe, aisle 12 for electrical," Frank replied. But his attention was on the customer 3 people behind Bob, a man in his 30s who had been in the store twice this week, buying items that individually looked innocent, but together formed a concerning pattern. Last Tuesday, 50 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, supposedly for his farm. Thursday, metal pipes and end caps, claimed he was installing irrigation. Today, digital timers, batteries, and copper wire, saying he needed to automate his sprinkler system. Frank had seen this exact purchasing progression hundreds of times during his ATF career, usually in the weeks before domestic terrorism attacks that killed dozens of people. "Can I help you find anything else?" Frank asked the suspicious customer, whose nervous demeanor and cash-only purchases had already triggered every instinct Frank had developed during nearly 2 decades of counterterrorism work. "No, I think I've got everything," the man said, avoiding eye contact while paying for materials that could construct a device capable of destroying a city block. After the customer left, Frank did something he hadn't done since his official retirement. He documented everything he'd observed using techniques that had been refined through hundreds of domestic terrorism investigations: customer description, vehicle information, purchase history, behavioral indicators, and most importantly, the material combinations that distinguished legitimate construction projects from bomb-making operations. That evening, Frank made a phone call to a number he'd hoped never to use again. ATF Counter-Terrorism Division, Agent Sarah Rodriguez speaking. Sarah, this is Frank Kowalski. There was a pause. Frank, how's the hardware store treating you? Quietly, Frank said, sitting at his kitchen table with purchase records and photographs that looked like normal inventory documentation but represented potential evidence of domestic terrorism planning. Sarah, I need to report suspected explosive material procurement. Agent Rodriguez had worked with Frank for 6 years before his retirement. She knew that when Frank Kowalski called about suspected explosive material procurement, it meant someone was planning to kill innocent people and needed to be stopped immediately. What are you seeing? Frank provided details with the precision that had made him legendary in ATF counter-terrorism operations: purchase patterns, material combinations, behavioral analysis, and threat assessment that suggested active bomb-making preparation rather than legitimate hardware store shopping. Frank, Rodriguez said after he finished, we'll coordinate with FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force and local law enforcement. Can you maintain normal operations while we develop surveillance? Affirmative, Frank said. If this follows the pattern I've seen before, he'll be back for timing mechanisms and additional chemical components within the next week. What happened next was 19 years of counter-terrorism expertise compressed into the most important retail shift of Frank's civilian life. He returned to Miller's Hardware the following morning, not just as a helpful store clerk, but as an experienced federal agent conducting surveillance in an environment where terrorists thought their material purchases were invisible among legitimate customer transactions. Over the next week, Frank identified 2 additional suspects coordinating with the original customer to acquire materials for what appeared to be a large-scale bombing operation. He documented their purchases, coordinated with Agent Rodriguez's surveillance team, and provided real-time intelligence that allowed federal agents to track the conspiracy before explosive devices could be completed. We've arrested 4 suspects and seized enough materials to construct 3 large explosive devices, Rodriguez told him during a briefing at the store after the operation concluded. They were targeting the federal courthouse during a high-profile trial next week. Timeline for the planned attack? Frank asked. Based on their material acquisition schedule and the trial calendar, we estimate they were less than 72 hours from execution. Your identification of the purchase pattern prevented what could have been a mass casualty domestic terrorism attack. The investigation revealed that the bombing conspiracy had been planned for over 4 months, with suspects systematically acquiring materials from multiple hardware stores while coordinating timing to coincide with maximum occupancy at their target location. Local news covered the story as a major domestic terrorism prevention by federal authorities, with no mention of the hardware store clerk who had recognized the purchasing signatures of bomb-making operations or the ATF retiree who had provided the expertise that prevented hundreds of deaths. A few weeks later, Miller's Hardware received a visit from regional law enforcement coordinators. Frank, said Detective Captain Lisa Chen, we understand you have some background in materials identification? Frank looked around the store, where families were shopping for weekend projects, contractors were picking up supplies for legitimate construction work, and customers were trusting that their neighborhood hardware store was a safe place to find tools and materials for improving their homes and lives. Some, he said simply, we'd like to implement enhanced awareness protocols for unusual purchase patterns. Would you be willing to consult on training other local retailers? Of course, Frank replied. Community safety is everyone's responsibility, especially when it comes to recognizing when normal products might be used for harmful purposes. What the detective captain didn't know was that she'd just asked one of the country's most experienced domestic terrorism prevention specialists to train retail workers to recognize exactly the kind of explosive material procurement that Frank had spent his career stopping. Frank never told the store customers about his ATF background or the bombing conspiracies he'd prevented. He never mentioned the domestic terrorism networks he'd infiltrated or the explosive devices he'd helped dismantle before they could kill innocent people. He just worked behind the counter every day, helped customers find the tools they needed, and quietly watched for purchase patterns that indicated someone was planning to turn hardware store materials into weapons of mass destruction. But word spread through law enforcement channels that if anyone noticed unusual purchasing patterns involving potential explosive materials, they should probably consult with the clerk at Miller's Hardware. Not officially, of course, just as a professional courtesy to someone who understood how domestic terrorists acquired the materials for their attacks. Every morning at 8 a.m., Frank opened the store and prepared for another day of helping customers with their projects. Most days, the biggest challenge was finding the right size bolt or explaining the difference between interior and exterior paint. But some days, when his trained instincts recognized purchase combinations that indicated bomb-making preparation, Frank Kowalski was exactly where he needed to be. Between innocent people and terrorists who would use everyday materials to cause mass casualties. Because that's what you do when you've spent your career preventing domestic terrorism attacks. You don't stop when you retire. You just find a new way to protect communities from people who would weaponize normal products to kill innocent families. And sometimes the most sophisticated bomb-making prevention in a community is provided by someone who looks like they're just trying to help you find the right screws for your home improvement project. Frank had spent 19 years tracking explosive materials through complex supply chains and criminal networks. Now he spent his retirement ensuring that one hardware store remained a place where people could buy tools and materials without funding terrorist operations they couldn't imagine. The mission was the same. The materials were the same. The only difference was that now, instead of investigating domestic terrorism attacks after they happened, he was preventing them before bombs could be built. And every day, as families improved their homes and contractors built their projects with materials from Miller's Hardware, Frank Kowalski worked with the eyes and experience of someone who knew the difference between legitimate purchases and terrorist procurement, ready to protect both the store and the community it served. So the next time you shop at your local hardware store, remember that the person helping you find supplies might have expertise far beyond product knowledge. The clerk explaining which fertilizer works best for your garden might be the same person ensuring that fertilizer isn't being used to construct explosive devices. Have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone whose retirement work perfectly positioned them to protect their community from threats most people never consider. Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet professionals who never stop watching for dangers that hide behind normal everyday activities. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in protecting innocent people from domestic terrorism. Because the world needs more people like Frank Kowalski, professionals who understand that some vigilance is too important to end with retirement. Until next time, remember that guardians come in all forms. Sometimes they wear federal badges and investigate bombing conspiracies. Sometimes they wear store aprons and help customers find tools. But they're always watching for patterns that threaten innocent lives, always ready to recognize when normal products are being assembled into weapons of mass destruction. And sometimes the most important terrorism prevention in your neighborhood comes from someone who spent their career learning exactly how domestic terrorists think and refuses to let them operate unchallenged in any community he calls home.